Hey, Snorgle. Welcome back to Exploring Minecraft. So this is the series where I explore Minecraft and also explore a particular topic. Last time we talked about confirmation bias, and I thought this time we'd delve into that topic a little bit more and talk about critical thinking skills. And so what is critical thinking? It's a little bit complicated, but essentially it's interpreting, analyzing, and evaluating something. It could be a hypothesis. It could be, hey, we're in Portal. It could be a hypothesis. It could be a problem you're trying to solve. It could be anything. It could be you hear information online and you're not sure what to believe. Anything like that. And so we're going to talk a little about that. There's sort of 8 aspects to it. And this is just my thing, right? This is let's see, 20. Oh, yeah, I'll take these. Heck yeah. Take some obby. Do we have obby anywhere? Is this our first obby thing? Oh no, right there. Okay. So, out. Put our boat out. We'll get going. Now we'll just swim. What the heck? So, in my opinion, critical thinking, in order to do it properly, sort of boils down to 8 different sort of elements. And these aren't necessarily linear. They're sort of asymmetrical generally. But it's analytical thinking, evaluation, logical conclusions, keeping an open mind, problem solving, which is probably the most important one, and self-reflection. You also, in addition to that, being able to communicate really well is super important. I think that a lot of people can be not very good communicators, and so it causes real problems with their critical thinking skills because they're not able to assimilate information and communicate that to the people they're trying to. And then the final one is decision making, being able to make good, analytical, objective decisions. So let's just dive into this and talk about it. Analytical thinking. What do I mean by analytical thinking? Look at that. That's really cool. Can I go up? So analytical thinking is, as human beings, we are very much subject to defining and seeing patterns. And that's just the way our brains work. We are exceptionally good at that. We're really, really good at seeing patterns. And developing that further, I think, is so important. And then once you define and can see what patterns are, then you can start to say, what are the trends in this? Starting to see what this pattern affects and what effect does it have. That's important too. It's a part of defining patterns. And analytical thinking is being able to gather relevant information for whatever you're trying to solve, the problem you're trying to solve. Let's say you don't know anything about cars and you want to understand why your car isn't starting. So getting relevant information is super important to that, right? Or let's say it's even something simple. You're working on, you hear something online, right? This is better. You hear something online and it's some sort of scandal or something, or somebody says something and you're not sure what to believe. There's 2 schools of thought. Some people say, yes, this is the way it is. And other people say, no, this is the way it's not. It's not that way. It's this way. Instead of allowing emotions or groupthink or anything like that dictate to you, you can use critical thinking skills to come up with an objective solution for whatever this question is. How do I understand how this happened and what's happening and what I think this means? Is it true? Is it not true? There's a lot of things that people push online that are not true, and there's a lot of people who believe them. And so being able to critically think your way out of these situations is really important. One of the aspects of critical thinking, as I think, is a lot of times what makes it really difficult is there's very complicated things that we're trying to solve for, right? And complicated things are difficult to understand by their very nature, right? They're difficult to understand, and how do you understand complicated things? Well, to me, the easiest solution to understanding complicated problems is, not falling down that death hole, first off, is taking, let's go around here, is being able to break complicated things down into smaller, more easily digestible and easy understandable parts. So taking this big complicated thing and taking one small aspect of it, and then being able to look at this larger problem as not one big large problem, but 15 small manageable problems. And part of the things about problems is looking at this and saying, what caused this? What caused this? What objectively caused this to happen? What objectively caused this to be the thing? What objectively caused this to be true? And what effect would that cause have? Would you say, when you look at this and you look at whatever you're trying to solve, would you say that this cause had the effect that you're saying it does? Does that make sense? And when you think about your argument that way, and that will allow you to come up with a hypothesis, right? You'll say, I think that this is the way it is because of A, B, and C. But then, in order to say that, your argument needs to be valid. It needs to make sense from an objective standpoint. So I think that's important. Another aspect of critical thinking is evaluation, and being able to evaluate problems in an objective way. And so part of evaluating problems is being able to, what's that? End up here. Jeez. Part of it is really being able to clearly define what you're trying to figure out. Because a lot of people don't do that. Whoa, man, that's a death hole. So being able to really define what the issue you're trying to do, looking at where you're getting this information from. Is it credible? Right? Is it relevant? May not be relevant. There's a lot of information that's included in some complex things that is completely irrelevant and just muddies up the sort of waters. And then once the part of evaluation is, what can I come up with a solution? And I think that there's a lot to be said for just brainstorming, coming up with ideas and iterating on them. Come up with an idea, evaluate it. Does it make sense? Maybe part of it doesn't, part of it doesn't. Switch it up and change it, and then just keep that loop going, right? Keep that loop going. It's important. Once you have that loop going, and you've look at your solution, and what's the outcome of your solution? What's the result of your solution, and does that make sense? And if at all possible, sometimes not possible, but at all possible, I do highly recommend trying to come up with a measurable criteria for success. And sometimes you can't. In the terms of our made up internet thing that you're trying to figure out if it's true or not. Sometimes you can't have a measurable success for that. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. But if at all possible, I highly recommend trying to come up with a objective, measurable criteria for success, because that's going to make, then when you have something that is objectively this, you can say, okay, this is a success. Hey, look, iron. Did I get that? Yeah, why not? I'm here. Okay. So Another thing that's really helpful, and we sort of talked about this in the evaluation, is being able, understanding logic and understanding logical conclusions. Let's go to sleep here in the middle of the snow. Why not? Let's see. We're gonna need this. We're gonna need that. We'll shove that in there. We'll shove this in here too. Why not? We're gonna need this in our bed and put our bed down. Get this because I always leave it. Okay. So to understand things logically and how you're going to come to logical conclusions. The way that I do it is I look at it and I review all the evidence and the arguments. So when I look at it and say, here's the evidence and arguments, and here's how I'm thinking of it, and does this make sense? Is it overly complicated? And we can talk a little bit now about Occam's razor, because most people view Occam's razor as, I've heard it paraphrased as, the simplest solution is often the correct one. And that's not exactly what it says. Occam's razor is close. Occam's razor basically says the solution that has the least amount of assumptions is typically the correct one. And that's subtly different. And so as you're looking at your logical conclusions, coming up with that's a really good way to help you review it and assess if it's relevant and credible. The other thing that can help you too is, and this is a huge part of critical thinking skills, is realizing that you may be coming into this with cognitive bias or confirmation bias. And so being open to looking at diverse viewpoints and problem solving, something you might not have considered before, something that maybe goes against something that you sort of think, but being able to really look at these diverse things and coming up and accepting them and considering them. And then you start coming up with your logic. What's the easiest way to get a pyramid up here? And you do your logical reasoning, and your logical reasoning allows you to draw conclusions for whatever you're trying to do, what problem you're trying to solve. In the case of the internet scandal, somebody said that I don't want to get too much into this because I don't want to get into scandal territory. It's not this channel was about, but there was a scandal sort of recently, scandal-ish, and there's two sides to this, and one of the sides is the accusing this internet person of being a fraud and a cheater and faking their identity and blah 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 blah. So in terms of this, you're looking at this and saying, okay, what's the credibility of these? Well, the credibility is that the accusations are done by someone who has a history of being very sus, and being an unreliable source. So you have to keep that in mind. You have to consider that. And it's not to say that that's going to be wrong, but ouch. But that's just a good thing to consider when you're thinking about this, right? And if you're exploring alternative ideas, just keeping an open mind is so important to critical thinking. It's crucially important to life in general, because it's going to make you grow as a person. And so when you're looking at solutions, trying to come up with ideas, think outside the box, get outside of your comfort zone, and explore alternative ideas that you wouldn't have before. And a big part of exploring alternative ideas that you're not comfortable with is going into it and try to be as judgment-free as possible. Give it, and because it could absolutely, your cognitive and confirmation bias could be completely justified, right? But also sometimes you come up with really interesting things that you never would have thought of had you not started looking in other places that you don't normally look. The other thing too is, as you're trying to solve this, you're talking to people who are trying to solve these problems, maybe get really good at cognitive, at accepting criticism, constructive criticism. I'm not talking about somebody who's insulting, critically insulting. People who are giving you constructive criticism, a lot of people do not take that very well. I work in a position where things get evaluated all the time, and people who aren't professionals and haven't developed the skill often get into when somebody looks at this, there's a little bit issue here and here, it gets into, I call it my baby ugly. It was a joke we always say, you call my baby ugly, because they're not used to, they put too much, they have too much at stake. And I had a professor once in college who said, I'm a formerly trained musician, I used to be professional, and I had a professor in college who once said, hold on to your ideas passionately, but loosely. So, we've done our analytical thinking, we've evaluated the problem, we've kept an open mind. We're coming now to probably what I think is one of the most important things in critical thinking skills, and that is problem solving. And there's so many aspects to problem solving, and we touched on a little bit of it, taking really complicated things and breaking them down into small, less complicated, and more easily understandable parts. That's a huge part of it. But a bigger part of it, I think even than that, is actually just being able to correctly define what the problem is. To sit down and say, what am I trying to solve here? What am I trying to solve? What am I trying to do? What information am I trying to get? That's gonna sort of make sure that the scope of what you're trying to do doesn't get out of control, and it also keeps you focused. Hey, village. That's so important. So how do you do that? Well, the first thing you want to do is start gathering relevant information, right? Looking for the information you need that's going to help you make these decisions and aid you in your goal. I'll take this. Once you... What is that? What is that? I don't know what that is. Huh. Once you get the relevant information, you can take a look at it and start coming up with solutions. And for me, is this only 2 houses? Is that true? And there's no village. Oh wait, no, there's more down here. Okay. I'm being stupid. Okay. Oh yeah, no, that's good. Okay. So when you're problem solving, I find that brainstorming ideas and then iterating on that is really helpful. And this is fun. So it kind of looks like a little inn or something. That's kind of what I think that is. Hi, kitty. Hello. So coming up with solutions, like you come up, once you've defined your problem, you've defined what you're trying to solve for. Yeah, I'll take these. Why not? Where is my... Here? Yeah. You define what you want to solve for. You've come up with a solution. Select and implement whatever you're trying to solve for. Which way am I going? This way? Select what you're trying to solve for. Implement that, or, in the case of this thing, come up with what you think is true. Review that. See what's working, see what's not working, revise, and keep that loop going. That's what I mean by iterating. Keep that sort of loop going until you come up with something that you're comfortable with, meets your criteria for success. Remember, we talked before about trying to come up with an objective criteria of success. So, part of looking at this and reviewing the outcomes, a big part of this is self-reflection. To be able to look at yourself and say, how did I do on this one? And being critical. And I don't mean being harsh, but I do mean being critical. Being critique your personal assumptions and biases. Did you allow these personal assumptions and biases to affect your problem solving, to affect the solutions you came up with in ways that might not be good, right? Did you? Maybe, maybe you did. I love mushrooms. Can you remove the mushrooms off their back? I guess not. No, that's too bad. I watch the sunset. Lovely. So for self-reflection, critiquing your personal assumptions and biases, looking at them and making sure that they're not negatively affecting your problem-solving skills. And then also, you want to look at insights for your self-reflection from really diverse sources and experiences. You want to really look at places that you don't normally look at that is going to give you a different window into self-reflection. That's super important. Once you've done that, be ready to just identify the mistakes you've made. Everybody makes mistakes, and so many people I see are so hesitant to admit mistakes. And look, mistakes just happen. It's just the way it is. It's what happens 99% of the time. That's why people get so excited about not making a mistake and succeeding, right? So accept those, admit your mistakes, and talk about what lessons have you learned and how is it going to affect your future actions, right? Super important. And then as you go through this, it's sort of like the brainstorm iterating. Do the same thing with this. Refine your thought process. Everything you learn, refine the thought process, have it tweak the future actions you're going to take. And what you're doing at this point is you're making yourself a better person. You're not just developing critical thinking skills. You're making yourself a better person, which is great. So another thing that I think is important in critical thinking, and it's not just in critical thinking, it's for a lot of things, but I think it's something I see is when we're talking about solving complicated problems, it can be extremely difficult to communicate them. So people have I'm not going to say that's a blanket statement, and I take it back. It can be extremely difficult to explain complicated problems in a simple, concise way. And I think that if you look at this in the terms of, like we talked about before, you take a very complicated thing and I almost fell down a hole. You take a very complicated thing and you break it down into significantly smaller, more manageable and more understandable parts. Then you can put it together and it makes more sense. And I think if you do that and you have that understanding of how those small parts work independently and how their relationship of when they're together, I think that being able to convey complex problems makes it is much easier. And the other aspect is, in addition to communicating, you need to learn how to and really be a good active listener. Really listen to what people are saying, especially if you're getting views from people who are outside of your normal frame, right? You're looking at diverse, interesting alternative sources. Actively listening to them and giving them the attention that they deserve, it's really important, super important, because it's really easy in these situations to sort of write off people that you might not have thought of, or situations you might have thought of otherwise. And when you are communicating, when you're actively listening, when you're communicating, we talk about confirmation bias and how people have a tendency of consuming things when it sort of fits into their current bias. And part of this, that you can take advantage of this a little bit, is you can tailor your message and your communication style to your audience. Because if you start doing that, they're going to be much more actively willing to listen to you. Even if what you're trying to explain to them, or what you're trying to solve, is something that they don't typically do, right? Oh, get down there. That's that's just so crucially important, is tailoring. Hey, baby turtle, is tailoring your message to your audience. And as you're doing that, also maybe think about, if you want to get information and you want to do this, I think another thing that's really good is being able to construct persuasive arguments in that tailored message. Think about what their confirmation bias is. Thinking about come up with it. I'm not talking about being manipulative. I just mean genuinely coming up with constructive arguments that's going to get your ideas across. That's just crucially important. Just in general, not just problem solving, but just in general, as a life tip. So I think that one of the final pieces, not quite the final, but one of the final things we're going to talk about here is, what do you do when you've looked at this complicated problem? You've looked at this complicated thing that you're trying to figure out. You figured it out. What now? Well, now it's time to decide something, right? like now you have to make a decision. And I think that when you're making a decision, donkey, I always think donkeys are majestic. I always think that one of the problems that people make in deciding is they don't define the criteria for the decision, you know? And I think that's important, like looking at and defining, what are your criteria for this decision that you're making specifically? What's the criteria that you're evaluating this decision on? And of that criteria, what are the short-term and long-term effects? Right? What are the consequences? Do they make logical sense? Because some stuff breaks down. It may seem right in the short term, but you look at it in the long term, it's like, oh, that's not right. That breaks down. It doesn't work. And, you know, we were talking a lot about objective criteria for success, but I want to say that it's so important to learn to balance your own personal intuition with logic. Because if you take your intuition and you intuit something, you start off, you intuit something, right? You say, this is what I think. And then you can look at it and say, and logically say, oh, you know what? I wasn't right. I need to adjust that. Well, you know what you're doing? You're changing your intuition. You're making your intuition better, right? You're superpowering your intuition, because your intuition will change over time. That it'll support your beliefs and your changes in beliefs, and it'll make you a better person. And pretty soon you can look at something and you'll be able to intuit it, and you'll be right. And then you can look at it and say, hey, I thought this intuitively, and my intuition was absolutely correct because I also measured it logically and objectively. So when you're doing this, it's important to understand that from a logical standpoint, if you're stepping outside of your comfort zone, you're looking at things you don't normally look at. You're thinking at things in ways you don't normally think. It'd be a little scary. Not gonna lie. And I'm not being sarcastic. I'm 100% serious. It's scary to do that. And because you're introducing uncertainty and risk. And so managing uncertainty and risk is important. And I feel like it's just even the idea of just looking at something and saying, okay, what does this mean from an uncertainty standpoint? And do I need a contingency plan for this? Right? Maybe you do. Maybe you don't. Maybe it's okay. You know, it's a level of risk you're willing to accept. But that's I think important to think about. And I want to talk a little about what are some barriers to thinking critically, because there are some, and they're pretty common. And I feel like this is one of the places where that just don't see as many critical thinking skills. The first one is, we've talked about this before, cognitive bias, right? So when you think that things happen a certain way, and you have beliefs, and those beliefs you just generally consider that's the way the world is, whether it is or not. That's the way it is. And in addition to that, you also think you're going to think a certain way. Cognitively, you think a certain way. And that can allow you to form arguments in particular ways that may not be effective or true. So that's something to be aware of. Does not let your biases get a little bit out of control. And I touched on it a little bit before. The other thing is groupthink. It's really easy to get into with your peers, and your peers may have a very specific way of thinking of some one particular thing, or may have thoughts about one particular thing. And groupthink is extremely powerful, and it's also pretty dangerous. And I'm not a huge fan of groupthink in most forms. I'll be honest with you. I think it has significantly more negatives than it does positives. So I just be aware of that, of groupthink, because it's really easy to fall into, particularly in the internet, because you can have a lot of groups that are just, they end up spiraling out of control, and that's unfortunate. I also feel sometimes that in understanding things, for the most part, there's no hurry. A lot of people think that problem solving should happen significantly faster than it realistically does. So don't let a time crunch affect this. Don't let a time crunch make you make some poor logic decisions, or just go with an intuition without stopping and making sure that it's right, or not doing your process, But as we talked about, getting outside comfort zone, and how that's scary, and it is. It's legitimately scary. That can cause emotions, and looking at things and looking at how things work definitely is emotional. It's understanding that you're going to have emotions about this, and it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Perfectly fine. But it is, but don't let the emotions rule the logic that you're going through. Understanding that you have emotions, and that's perfectly fine, but that they don't really have a place in the decision-making process. Their job is something different than that. And this is something that isn't really something for me, because I have a tendency of not accepting general authority. I've always been that way. Like, it's got to make logical sense to me, or I just kind of go from there. Not that I'm a troublemaker or anything. I'm just saying, but an over reliance on authority, I think can be a little dangerous. And so just being aware of not automatically just accepting what an authority says, but evaluating it, right? Being critical of it, evaluating it, look at it, and try to turn it around and really spin it and make sure that it makes sense before you just automatically accept it. And then, as we talked about before, being able to communicate, not just with other people, but with yourself as well. Complexity is just so important. And the one thing to take away from this is, if you look at something and you don't understand it, start breaking it down into smaller things, in smaller, manageable chunks, until it's small enough and manageable stuff you can understand it. And then start looking at putting the screws together and putting it back together slowly, piece by piece, so that you not only understand how these small little things work, right? But you also understand how the whole thing works now, and in a way that you can explain it and communicate it very clearly. Jazz bassist Charles Mingus once said, "Making the simple complex is commonplace. Making the complex simple, awesomely simple, that's creativity." And I think that that's true. I think that it's difficult to do. It's not impossible, but I think that there are skills to do it. And breaking things down into small, manageable chunks is probably the number one lesson that most people could learn. And don't just start believing stuff because it comes from an authoritative source or everybody else believes it. Really think about it. Give it some thought. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble on as I explore Minecraft about critical thinking skills. I did the one last time on confirmation bias, and I just thought, let's dive a little bit more into this subject because I really like this subject. I think it's interesting, and I think it's just such an important subject. And especially in this time where we have a not insignificant number of people on the internet who are acting in bad faith, who have an alternative reason for doing the things they say and saying what the things they say, and it's just so important to be able to think and evaluate what things are and are they true and are they not. So thank you so much, and I'll see you next time for more Exploring Minecraft, where we will talk about maybe something a little less heavy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.